It's time for yet another GCSE style mock. Yay! With me, Mr. Crosby, and I'm going to be looking at June 2010 today, the Land of Freedom depth study, and we're going to be looking at question 6 on this paper. Okay, you should know by now that you're going to either do question 5 or question 6. So we're going to start by looking at question A, and this is our describe question. Describe the education provision for African Americans before 1950. There's no explanation required for this type of question. All you need to do is come up with 4 things that you can say about this. Okay, so you're just identifying things. Now, you're either going to get your marks from coming up with a relevant point, or you might get a mark for a supporting detail. Let's look at what we might say then. So, separate schools for black and white children. That would get you 1 mark. Now, if you look schools for black children less well equipped, that could be considered a supporting detail for the first one. Okay, it's directly related. You can't have more than 1 mark for a supporting detail, so you've got to come up with some other things. You might have noticed, if you've been looking very carefully, there's probably something wrong with this one here. I disagree with the mark scheme. Controversial, I know, but look at the phrase of the question: before 1950. And then an example in 1950. That doesn't add up to me, but we'll let that one go. But what else might we have said? Well, we could have said something like universities were closed, or the Jim Crow states in the South had a stronger segregation in education. We could have said something about the distance black children tended to have to travel to school compared with white children. We might have said that teachers in white schools were paid more than those in black schools. Okay, so those are some things you might have done. But all we're going to need for this question are 4 points that we can say about this. Okay, so if you've not got the 4 points, chances are it's just down to background knowledge that you might need to brush up on. Moving on to question B now. Okay, this is an explain question, bread and butter explain question for 6 marks. Okay, and the question is: explain why events in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957 were important. For level 2, which is going to get us either 2 or 3 marks, all we're going to do is identify or describe reasons. Okay, so here are some potential reasons for why the events in Little Rock were important. Arkansas failed to integrate. Okay, Falbus, that's the governor if you remember, would not allow 9 black students to attend. It required action at presidential level, or Falbus' actions were popular. Bear in mind that these are just examples, and you might have some other legitimate reasons. Okay, and these are legitimate. Okay, you have identified reasons for Little Rock being important. However, we are still left asking the question why. Okay, that's my rule of thumb if I'm marking them myself. Am I still wondering why this means that the events were important? Okay, have you actually explained it or not? Okay, if I have explained it, then I can get 4 marks. Okay, that brings us on to level 3. Okay, let's have a look at this one. You can see integration was introduced quickly and effectively in some states, but met with bitter resistance in others. Arkansas had still not integrated 3 years later. Okay, we can still see that this last sentence is very similar to this top one. Arkansas failed to integrate, but we're given additional information to help explain why this was so significant. Okay, it was introduced quickly, however, bitter resistance from others. Okay, in other states. So that means that the Arkansas case would be an important one because you can see that 1957 has not produced as much progress as it should have. For my money, however, this is still a very weak explanation. Okay, 4 marks. okay, but it's not what we would call a developed explanation. This here is a much better reason, okay. So firstly, look at the precise detail given. 1957, Supreme Court ordered the Governor Falbus to let 9 students, remember, Elizabeth Eckford is one of those, to attend a white school in Little Rock. Falbus ordered out the state troops to stop this happening. Okay, state troops employed. Okay, he claimed that this was because he could not guarantee their safety. Falbus only backed down when Eisenhower, identifying the president, sent federal troops to protect the students. Okay, the student here has understood the difference between state troops and federal troops, states being those employed by that specific state, whilst federal governs the whole country. The troops stayed for 6 weeks, but once they withdrew, there were no further major racial incidents at the school. Falbus' actions gained him widespread popularity, and he was re-elected for a total of 6 terms. Okay, so we can see here that the student has explained a single reason, which relates to this top reason. Falbus' actions were popular, but they've included a lot of information from their own knowledge, and they've related it back to the question. Okay, we know why the events made him popular. Okay, we know why that. Therefore, we know why it's important in this case. For level 6, we've got to have 2 reasons. Okay, you can either have 3 basic explanations, or 1 developed and 1 basic explanation. And I tell my students to actually just come up with 2 developed explanations here. Okay, 3 basic explanations, that can actually be quite difficult to think of 3, especially in the pressure of an exam. So if you can think of 2 and do them very well, then you cover yourself, okay, just in case one of them is not deemed to be developed enough. So our target is going to be to come up with 2 reasons explained. Okay, so what I want you to do now is you're going to pause the video. Okay, working in a pair if it's available. I want you to compare your answers. Okay, and I want you to come up with some targets for next time. Okay, if one of you's done it very well and the other one has dropped more marks, then that one might want to show where their answer has done well that the other one could learn from. Okay, so have you come up with your 2 reasons? So did you get 2? Were they legitimate? Did you actually answer the question why? Did you relate it back to the question? And was there this precise evidence that backed up your point? That means that we could call this a developed reason. Okay, so pause the video, come up with your targets, and then we'll carry on. Right, our last question is our 10 marker, and I always tell students, when you've got a choice, as in this one you've got to choose between question 5 and question 6, I would use the 10 mark question as a guideline as to which to do, because that is half the total marks for the question. Okay, if you can do this one really well, you're on a good course for an excellent grade. Okay, question C is always a sort of how far, how successful in this case type question. Okay, implying that we're going to need balance, and you're always told to explain your answer. Okay, and what we want to be looking at in this case is how successful was the struggle for civil rights in the 1950s. Remember, this is the 1950s, so we're not moving on to the 1960s. So occasionally you're going to get a question that requires a good chronological understanding, and this is one of those. So for example, with the education, we could be including the Brown case here. We could have gone back to the Little Rock case from the earlier question and used that again, but we wouldn't have been able to use James Meredith because that was 62. Okay, we can use the Montgomery bus boycott. However, the Freedom Rides would have been slightly too late. In fact, the sit-ins were really an early 60s phenomenon as well. Okay. So I'm surprised that that appears in the mark scheme. That's quite generous. Okay. You can also see that we've got some things down here that suggest that there's a lack of success. And we'll come back to that element of balance later. But here, again, like the level 2 in the explain question, we're just identifying reasons here. Okay, reasons for either it being a success or a failure, but there's no explanation. Okay, and that's where our level 3 comes in. We're going to explain either success or failure for 4 to 6 marks. Developed again appears here, which means that the better explanations get the higher marks. Let's have a look at some more examples. So we're going to look at one example from each side of the argument here. We'll go to the Brown one. So the Brown case, 1954, the student knows the date, so they're already showing that they have a wide range of knowledge. Okay, they challenge segregation. They know where the Brown case was in Kansas there. It's challenging separate but equal ruling, so they understand the background. And the Chief Justice adjudged that even if facilities were equal, separate education was psychologically harmful to black children. Okay. The Supreme Court agreed in defiance of President Eisenhower's wishes. And then this final sentence is absolutely crucial. The case seemed to remove all constitutional sanctions for segregation. Okay, so that is a direct response to the question here. It relates back to the main issue: was the struggle for civil rights a success? And this states that it was. Okay, so this last sentence is incredibly important because it relates back to the question. Okay, however, if we look down here, we can see an example of why this we might argue against success in the 1950s. So down here, it acknowledges that the Brown case was successful at court, but that desegregation had not been achieved even by 1955. Okay. It also acknowledges that throughout the South there is still resistance, including the KKK. And we've got a very, very key phrase here: formed to defend segregation, showing that we are still thinking about this question. Okay. In this case, you might also have wanted to bring in the Little Rock incidents again to show that even 3 years after the Supreme Court, there is still this ongoing battle in the school system for an equal education. So the first thing we're going to need to do is explain reasons, and they've got to relate back to the question. Okay, so explain reasons. Now, if we look at level 4, okay, you've got to explain success and failure. Okay, and there. Okay, that's both sides. So if we want to get above 6 marks, we're going to need to simply argue for and against. Okay, so we've got to give both sides. Okay, now this is quite an early mark scheme. Later mark schemes now state that for 8 or more marks, okay, there must be a sense of balance. I'm not going to spend all my time arguing for and not spend any time arguing against. Okay, there should be a roughly 50-50 split. They want to know that you understand in depth both sides of a historical debate. Okay, so we're going to need balance in our answer to get us up to 8 marks. Okay, doesn't mean you have to have no opinion yourself. It doesn't mean you have to agree with either side. What you're doing is you're showing an awareness of different ways of viewing the situation. Okay, and then for that 10 marks at the end, okay, our prize goal of 10 marks, we need to evaluate how successful total. Okay, some sort of conclusion is needed here. And what I suggest students do is they come up with a justified conclusion. Okay, justified conclusion. So we need to come to an overall conclusion, but the reason I say justified is what I don't want to see students doing is saying that overall it was a success or overall it was a failure, and then just re-explaining what they've already said. Okay, that's already been stated. What we need to be doing instead is saying why the successes outweigh the failures, or vice versa. Why the successes more important than the failure. For example, you might state that overall the struggle in the 1950s was a success, despite setbacks. This improved the situation and paved the way for later developments as well, or something like that. So that brings us to the end of our video. So when we finish, I want you to go through your 10-mark answer in pairs if available. I want you to just see, did you understand the demands of the question? Okay, were you able to identify those reasons and explain them properly? Did you have a two-sided argument that achieved balance? And how was your conclusion? Did you really show you that you weren't just picking a side randomly, but understood why one might outweigh the other one? Okay, so go through that, compare your answers, come up with some targets, and then the last thing I'd like you to do is redraft one of these three questions, the one that you struggled on the most, implementing these new targets, so that next time we do this type of question, you can go back to those targets and use those before even starting them. Okay, thanks for listening.